So, the challenges presented here. We're going to start with anti Semitism. And although not born in the 20th century, everything has echoed this age old hatred. In fact, it's been called the oldest hatred. Anti Semitism goes back to ancient times. The Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague or the Black Death, the blood libel, using the blood of Christian children for Jewish religious purposes and rituals, poisoning the well, very often sharing water. And, the Jews were seen as something to be feared, something to be afraid of, different, this othering, but mostly for the charge of deicide, which means the killing of the Christian God, in this case, Jesus Christ. Most thought or believed, most anti Semites believed, that the Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. This was not debunked until the 1960s when the Vatican II removed this from Catholic Mass. So, all of these reasons were just used as justification for Jewish persecution throughout history. The term anti Semitism was coined by a man named Wilhelm Marr in 1879. So, anti Semitism from 1898 to 1941. Jews were categorized as part of the Hebrew race under US law. And if this is triggering anybody or sparking any familiarity to the Nazis, you would be correct. What the Nazis did was they made Judaism a race rather than a religion, a peoplehood, a culture, a community. It was no longer that under the Nazis. It was considered a race. So now, under US law, in these early days, the Hebrew race becomes a thing. The hatred, fear, discrimination, and prejudice against Jews as individuals or as a group were based on those age-old stereotypes and myths. So those didn't go anywhere. Those were just passed down from generation to generation, and people were still believing it as immigration continued in America. So what is anti-Semitism? I'm going to play a little clip for you from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and then we'll go on.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
The suspect in today's mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh had an extensive anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish digital footprint.
He's talking about all these Jews need to die.
On the last day of Passover, bloodshed in the middle of Shabbat services.
We believe that the suspects held views that reflected hatred of the Jewish people.
Violent attacks against Jews are on the rise. In the US, anti-Semitic incidents are at the highest levels in 40 years and have more than doubled in the past 10. These attacks all have a common root: anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism means prejudice against or hatred of Jews, and it can take many forms. The Holocaust, during which Nazis and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jews, is the worst example of anti-Semitism in history. But it also exists in daily life. A popular meme depicts a man, meant to be Jewish, with exaggerated, grotesque features. A social media influencer makes a joke about the Holocaust, or does a Nazi salute in a video shared with millions of followers. Hateful hashtags trend on Instagram. School buildings are defaced with swastikas. Someone argues that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. These are all expressions of anti-Semitism that can become dangerous if left unchallenged. Sometimes, anti-Semitism doesn't sound like hatred. It might even sound complimentary. For example, Believing that all Jews are good with money can open the door to more overtly anti-Semitic beliefs, such as all Jews are greedy. When repeated over and over and not questioned, stereotypes can be accepted as truth, and that can eventually lead to biases and hatred of an entire group. The Holocaust began with words, not killing. And while there's no direct connection between sharing a meme and violent attacks, when left unchecked, anti-Semitism creeps into all aspects of society and starts chipping away at democratic values. The more you hear or see anti-Semitism in your social media feed or casual conversations, the more accustomed or numb you become to hateful and dangerous beliefs and behavior, which is why it's important to never ignore it, overlook it, or accept it.
So that clip just affirms that what is old is new. So none of this has really changed. In the early 20th century, on the verge of the 20th century, we're seeing these old hatreds come back. So back to the era of this Jewish immigration. They were facing nothing new. Discrimination was social rather than legal. So, unlike the Nazis in the 1930s, would make legislation against Jews, this discrimination was social, meaning among their peers, among their communities and their neighborhoods. Theories that deemed Jews racially inferior were commonplace. A lot of those old stereotypes coming back in. Jews were overwhelmingly included amongst white people in law. So legally, they were in the white people bracket. This was not the case for immigrants who were Asian, Black, and other people of color, simply because um, physical appearance, they were white, and other immigrants had some sort of physical difference. Now, 1924, we see the Immigration Act, and this is President Calvin Coolidge signing this act on the White House South Lawn. This act aimed to return the U.S.'s ethnic makeup to what it had been in 1890. Quotas were set at 2% of the population of the US based on the 1890 census. So not 1924, 1890. This aimed to exclude Eastern European Jews and Southern Italian Catholics. Quotas functionally only applied to Europe. So the immigrants coming in from Europe, this would, of course, apply to all of them coming to the United States. This, as a result, dramatically reduced the number of immigrants, especially Jews, to the United States. This led to an increase in the number of undocumented immigrants. So they're still going to come over. The question is if it's legal or not. Later on, we'll see that this very act blocked millions of Holocaust refugees from finding refuge before, during, and after World War II. So this is going to prove very detrimental to the European Jewish population wishing to find a new land in America. This also leads to the rise of white supremacy. Anti-Semitism reaches a new peak in the US during the 1920s and the 1930s. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, took place in early 20th century. They were originally founded focused on defending slavery. White supremacy grew into these opposing rights for African Americans and aimed at terrorizing Black people through the use of violence. So their very appearance, in these white sheets, these white hoods, made to look like ghosts or something supernatural in order to scare Black people from wherever they were living, whatever plantation they were on. It was a scare tactic. This brings us to Leo Frank. Leo Frank in 1913, he was a Jewish American. He was lynched by an angry mob in Atlanta after being found guilty for the rape and murder of a 13-year-old Christian girl named Mary Fagan. He employed her, and most researchers think that this accusation did not stand, that he was wrongly accused. Um, those very citizens who advocated for his guilt and the ones who actually ended up lynching him were responsible for this revival of the KKK. So they went on and continued their white supremacy. Um, but Frank's trial led to the birth of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And of course, they are the leading Jewish group fighting anti-Semitism in the United States. This man, Henry Ford, I know a lot of people recognize his name, and mostly from the automobiles and everything that he did for the automotive industry in Michigan. However, Henry Ford was a staunch anti-Semite. He purchased his hometown newspaper called the Dearborn Independent and used this to publish anti-Semitic articles and materials. So, he at the time of Henry Ford, we're looking at, the war and the Great Depression, the First World War, and the Great Depression absolutely decimating the economy, led to a greater sense of community, though, among American Jews. They sought to bury their differences and stress their independence. Well, it also was ripe for an environment of scapegoating, and that's what Ford actually preyed upon. Jews were often blamed for the economic downturn and for the problems that society was facing. The anti-Semitic Henry Ford, he amplified these, calling the Jews greedy and controlling. He also referred to President Roosevelt's New Deal, supposed to be positive, supposed to be the answer to combating the Depression. He referred to it as the Jew Deal. So he was definitely an anti-Semitic agitator, went so far as publishing material, like I said, saying that the Jews were a conspiracy and they were set on poisoning American society, infecting America all over. Henry Ford was also a huge fan of Adolf Hitler's. World War II in America, and we won't go into the specifics of the World War. That's for another class. But I do want to stress that approximately 550,000 Jews served in the U.S. Armed Forces during the war. The war, of course, had special meaning to a lot of these Jews. Many were motivated by the stories coming back from Europe about the Holocaust. Some had members of their family still unaccounted for in Europe, which made them want to fight even more. For many, their Jewish identities were kind of a mixed bag. They were, on one hand, a source of pride, but on the other, perilous, because they were constantly aware that this presented a bit of a danger going into the European theater to fight. What if they were captured? What if they were held prisoner of war? How were Europeans going to treat them in the midst of what was happening to the Jews of Europe? Finally, we'll conclude with an excerpt from Ken Burns's documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. This is a little clip highlighting the denial of refugees in the United States, and how anti-Semitism was responsible for countless acts and defeating bills that came up about letting children into the country, letting other European refugees into the country, definitely slowed things down, and how anti-Semitism can contribute to this fear of evolution. So let's take a look.
In February 1939, Democratic Senator Robert Wagner of New York and Republican Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers of Massachusetts introduced a new bill.
The bill says let's let in 10,000 kids between the age of 5 and 14 per year, 1939 and 1940, and let's not count them against the immigration quota system.
The First Lady backed the bill. Her husband privately offered advice on how it might be passed, but said nothing in public. But the American Legion, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies were all opposed. They had favored some of the 60 bills that had recently been introduced to reduce immigration quotas.
It's a xenophobic refusal. I can't explain it because it seems so cruel to me, especially given a country as big as the United States with plenty of space. I do understand it in terms of anti-Semitism. I don't want to understand that anti-Semitism could be so deep and so cruel.
If I know the American public who fought the League of Nations propagandists.
Father Coughlin called for the creation of a national Christian front to combat the influence of what he called communistic Jews, and claimed to his vast radio audience that Jewish businessmen were firing their Christian employees to make room for Jewish refugees.
There is still the United States Senate with whom these forces must contend.
The restrictionists, people who want to restrict immigration, the isolationists, the anti-Semites come out of the woodwork. Democrats, Republicans, people say things like, well, 10,000 ugly children will grow into 10,000 ugly adults.
What has happened to us in this country? We have always been ready to receive the unfortunates from other countries, and though this may seem a generous gesture on our part, we have profited 1,000-fold by what they have brought us. Eleanor Roosevelt.
No group was more adamantly opposed to admitting Jewish refugees than the German-American Bund. 20,000 members would fill Madison Square Garden on Washington's birthday. They were led by Fritz Kuhn, a German immigrant who fancied himself the American Führer.
What we are actively fighting for under our charter. First, a social just white Gentile ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
Other speakers railed against the president, Frank D. Rosenfeld, and his Jew deal.
We only call upon our leaders to awake to the fact that the Jew is as alien in body, mind, and soul as any other non-Aryan, and that he is 1,000 times more dangerous to us than all the others by reason of his parasitic nature. Great floods of tears for a few 100,000 job-taking so-called poor Jewish refugees, who incidentally in general have more of this world's goods than you or I will ever possess.
A Fortune magazine poll found that only 1 in 10 respondents favored increasing quotas or making exemptions for refugees, and 4 out of 10 believed Jews had too much power in the United States. It further found that 85% of American Protestants and 84% of Catholics opposed offering sanctuary to European refugees. So did more than a quarter of Jewish Americans. During hearings on the bill to admit some refugee children, a witness said that it should be passed because it was true to the American tradition of providing sanctuary for religious and political refugees. New York Congressman Samuel Dickstein gently corrected him. This is the form of our government, but as a matter of fact, we have never done the things we preach. We talked about it.